Censorship and self-censorship of life-saving information is sadly the norm in Britain today, thanks to the globalist collaborators who own the cartel-run Fourth Reich transmitters and the printing presses. So, if you can restream us live or rebroadcast, just let me know, and we'll credit you here. So, we'll start just if you could introduce yourself, David, because I know Professor David Miller, Dr. David Miller, you are actually one of the few people in the country who have been cancelled in actually extraordinary fashion here at Bristol University. And I do wonder, because I first got to know you up at Strathclyde University in Glasgow. You came a little bit closer at Bath University as well for a while. Then you ended up here in Bristol. I wonder if they were bringing you in for the kill, because you have been a controversial sociologist for many years, pointing out all sorts of problems with the propaganda, particularly to do with demonising Muslims over the years, but many more things besides, including being involved in starting this thing called Spinwatch, which is looking at so-called expert opinion on our television screens. So can you just tell us why you think that you've been sidelined and basically cancelled from Bristol University?
Good evening, Tony. It's pretty clear, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned my history of controversy. I would prefer to put it a different way, that I've, over the years, done empirical research and found things out about how the world is. And I've been particularly interested, as you've said, in propaganda. I started off my work, my research for my PhD back in the 80s on the conflict in the north of Ireland, and looked there at the propaganda activities of all the participants in the conflict, including armed participants such as the British Army, the Royal Constabulary, and armed organisations which were illegal as well. And what came out of that in the end was an abiding interest in the way in which particularly states, but also corporations, use information to pursue power. And in particular, of course, they use information in a way which results in them saying things which are not true, to use a technical sociological term, which is not heard much in proper public discussion these days. So I'm interested in how lies are told. I'm interested in, to quote the title of a long ago Channel 4 documentary, I'm interested in the truth about lies, and that means, of course, that when you point out the lies, that the people who told the lies tend to get a bit shirty with you. They tend not to like being told that they're lying, even if it's true that they're lying. And all the way through this period, since the 1980s, I've attempted to tell the truth as much as I can, and to find out the truth about how power operates, and in particular, both state power and corporate power. So that's been my kind of approach, and I became cancelled, if you like, if you want to use the term, as a result of my work on Zionism. I've done work on state lobbies, on corporate lobbies for many, many years, decades in fact, but it was when I started to do work on Zionism, which essentially was after the Iraq War, that I started to be attacked in the kind of way which has in the end resulted in me being sacked from the University of Bristol. I mean, that goes back, 12, 13 years. And the difficulty is that when you say things about Zionism, when you do research about Zionism, you discover what Zionism is. It's an ideology, and it's an actually existing movement to put in place a Jewish state, which is the term that they use in what they would refer to as the Holy Land, or in Palestine, as most of the rest of the world knows it. Then when you discover the facts about that, the way in which it was a state founded on ethnic cleansing, as a result of the Nakba, in which they expelled or killed Palestinians from the territory, and you say things like that about it, then they don't like that, and they want to stop you saying that. And of course they devote, meaning the State of Israel and the wider Zionist movement, they devote a huge amount of resources and effort to stopping people saying Zionism is racism, it's a form of settler colonialism, and it depends on ethnic cleansing, not just in 1948, not just in 1881 when they started doing it, but today in Silwan, in Sheikh Jarrah, in East Jerusalem, and in many other places besides in the occupied territory. So it was talking about Zionism which got me cancelled, as you put it, and specifically it was about in saying that Zionism is racism, and that the people should not be fooled by the kind of arguments that one gets about this is only a form of Jewish self-determination. So I was attacked by the Community Security Trust, a pro-Israel lobby group, which claims not to be a pro-Israel lobby group. And indeed, then when they couldn't get any response from the university, they couldn't have me sacked. They got the Union of Jewish Students to attack me and to send complaints to the university, complaints which were manifestly ridiculous. They continued the campaign, and after a long investigation, I was found not guilty of all charges. And then they continued to try and get me investigated again, and they succeeded only some 6 weeks later, after the initial investigation had concluded I was not guilty of all charges. They managed to manufacture another investigation, which eventually resulted in me being sacked in October last year. So we know what it was that had me cancelled. It was the Zionist movement, the onslaught on academics, on school teachers, on all sectors of society by supporters of Zionism has been a truly miraculous thing to watch.
Well, I'm not sure I describe it as a miracle, but anyway, Desmond Tutu said something, and he died over Christmas time, but it was a very important thing I think he said before he died, which was that he felt that the way that the Israeli state was treating the Palestinians was actually far worse than the apartheid that he and his friends suffered in South Africa, because the South African government didn't actually want to wipe out the coloured people, the black people in South Africa. They actually wanted just to beat them down and to demoralise them and then to work for them. Do you think that's a fair comparison between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid?
Well, this is quite a significant distinction between the settler colonialism that we saw in South Africa and that which we see in Palestine. And if you look to other forms of settler colonialism, there are basically two types of settler colonialism. There are settler colonists who go and take the land and want the natives to work for them, and they exploit them in their businesses to do that. That's the case of South Africa. And there are the cases where they don't want the natives to work for them. They want to kill the natives. And that's the case, of course, in Palestine, as well as it was in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, where the purpose of settler colonialism was to wipe out the natives. And of course, they did it very successfully in the US. They haven't done it so successfully so far in Palestine, but that is the logic. The whole logic of the settler colony, of setting up the settler colony in Palestine, was that they would not have Arab labour. In fact, this is people don't understand this. People talk about the early days of Zionism and the socialist idealists who were a part of the movement setting up the kibbutzes in Palestine, as if this was something which had gone wrong in later years when Zionism becomes much more right-wing. On the contrary, socialism was required so that they could convince young Jews to work together collaboratively in a cooperative socialist way, in order that they could make sure that they didn't need to employ Arab labour. And in fact, right-wing Zionists at the time who insisted on employing Palestinians were physically attacked. Not just the Palestinians were attacked, but the right-wing Zionists were attacked by the left-wing Zionists for the sin of employing Palestinians. And so that is a useful comparison, I think, that Tutu made, and it does show one key distinction between South Africa and Israel, which is that the tendency in Israel is towards genocide.
Well, yes, really, that is worrying. Look, you and some of your friends and supporters at Bristol University, obviously, sociology is a subject which can needle the wealthy, the powerful, that want to use society for their own ends. That's actually one of the purposes of the science. So you are you and your colleagues must be, some people anyway, scratching their heads wondering, what is this really all about? I wonder what you think the wider agenda is. Where is this all heading? Why is it that people like you are persona non grata, and those that are putting the Palestinian cause, who after all are most definitely the underdogs in the Holy Land at the moment, that someone has decided that we don't want these people to have a voice anymore or a career? It's a sort of way of, the cancel culture is basically a way of depriving people like you of credibility on the airwaves and also of a living.
That's true. I mean, there's a wider question, isn't there, about the culture and about whether you can have debates on controversial topics. And, I don't want to get into other topics, but there's a very poisonous debate over the whole question of trans rights, which has been similar in some respects. So that there is a wider issue in terms of freedom of speech and academic freedom. But in relation to Israel, well, why is it they want to do this? Well, because the Palestinians, the existence of the Palestinians, and the fact of people supporting them in their millions around the world is a threat to the project of the Zionists, which is to silence and remove the Palestinians. So they kind of have to do this. Now, we don't have to go along with it, but nevertheless, many public institutions, like universities, do go along with it because they don't really understand what they're facing, and they feel it's the easier thing to do is to go along with this than to stand against it. And particularly, one of the ways in which they do that is that they buy into the idea that when people express anti-Zionist views, they are in some way oppressing Zionists, and in particular, in the context of the university, oppressing Zionist students. So that's the kind of the difficulty there. It's a form of identity politics which we don't just see in relation to Israel-Palestine, but in other issues too. So the university, in a sense, have gone along with this kind of form of identity politics, which says, well, if Jewish students don't like anti-Zionists expressing their views, meaning Zionist Jewish students, because of course many are in fact anti-Zionist, if they don't like that, then that somehow is some form of oppression of them, almost some kind of breach of the Equality Act, a discrimination of them as Jews. But of course it's nothing of the sort, because what's being expressed here is anti-Zionism, which is a political point of view, not anything to do with racism.
When we were told by Pat Hart, who's our station manager at Bristol Community FM, his reason to say, well, we want you off FM now, was very simple. It was that, I don't want to have to deal with any potential complaints about your programme. Not that he'd actually dealt with any of the previous complaints, because he just sent them to me and I'd written a response to Ofcom. But anyway, Ofcom was invoked last week at Prime Minister's Questions by Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, saying that he wanted Ofcom to look at getting rid of Russia Today. Well, what instead happened, David, was the removal of RT anyway by the broadcasting companies, people like Eutelsat and also YouTube. So in a way, the corporations, the companies that own our telecommunications infrastructure actually switched off RT. They didn't even give Ofcom a proper chance to do any kind of deliberation. So in a way, the government has kind of sidestepped this. The government hasn't been involved in turning RT off this week, which I think is an extremely significant move. That it's the companies themselves, the telecommunications industry, has just basically switched them off.
Yeah, I mean that's how it works, isn't it? It's a very, very worrying set of developments, isn't it, the last week? And I know we're going to come on to talk about Russia and Ukraine, but the kind of atmosphere that there is now is, I think, really very reminiscent of what happened in the period in the run-up to the First World War, where, as the students of history will recall, the international left was solid against imperialism and against war until the moment where they weren't, and the left split asunder catastrophically at that stage, the international split, and many parts of the left in France and Germany and the UK decided to side with their own ruling classes rather than to side with the international proletariat, which is their avowed position previous. And I think that we see something similar today over the Russian question, because now you mention the word Russia, and people, I see just now actually that the hashtag Kill Putin is trending on Twitter. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to be the case, and it's very worrying that we have gone into this kind of really dark phase of our history where there is an overwhelming crescendo of anti-Russian feeling circulating freely in the media.
I also think the Russians have made a significant impact in the Middle East with their air cover in Syria and protection of the government in Damascus, of President Assad. 3 or 4 years ago, we kept hearing, Assad is about to be toppled, blah, blah. The Russians stepped in. And the two things we've talked about so far are connected, David, with the looming confrontation, potentially anyway, between the Zionists and the Iranian Republic and the censorship of Russia, because the two potentially may be linked. I wonder whether you think that the very, very strong Zionist lobby, which has obviously made massive inroads into the Labour Party since the departure of Jeremy Corbyn, is actually a kind of home front in a coming Middle East war.
Well, these things are to some extent complicated. I mean, you may have seen in the last few days the signs that the Israelis are hedging their bets a little bit over the Ukraine situation, notwithstanding they have made public notes of support for the Ukraine. And also one of the Israelis' key allies in the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, has also been hedging its bets on the whole question of Russia and has been developing its relationships with Russia. And note that although the Russians have supported the Syrian Arab Republic under Bashar al-Assad, that they have also collaborated with the Israelis to allow the Israelis to strike Hezbollah in positions in Syria. So that's a slightly complicated question. Of course, you're right that the Israelis want to isolate and defeat the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that would be a catastrophic thing if they were to try and do that. But it's not clear that that what the overall steps of geopolitical relations are, because what everyone says about the Ukraine, and we'll come on to that, the Russian state itself under Putin has some really interesting things to be said about it. I mean, what they did in Chechnya and the way in which they have operated in geopolitically is not, of course, something which internationalists of today would support, but nonetheless, we are seeing an attempt to surround and encircle Russia by NATO, by the NATO powers.
Yeah, I do wonder whether the whole retreat from Afghanistan was, I suppose, to give the troops a rest before they went into Europe. This does seem to be that one of the main purposes behind the switching off of RT and the increasing demonising of Russia. What's your thoughts, though, on the justice of the Russian cause going into Ukraine, David? What's your bottom line on that?
Well, I mean, if you look back at the history of Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine has historically, at least part of Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine, has historically been part of what was the Russian Empire. The western part, and indeed part of what is now Poland, which used to be Ukraine, has not been so obviously part of the Russian nation. And I presume that what will be the strategy of Putin is to find a way to split Ukraine into an eastern country which is pro-Russian, or perhaps to absorb that part of the Ukraine into Russia. I would have thought more likely a a sort of pro-Russian country on Russia's borders. But clearly what's happened, and you've only got to, I mean, your listeners should go and do this actually if they can. Only go and got to go and listen to Chomsky or to John Mearsheimer or to amazingly enough to Henry Kissinger on this question to see that there are views within the Western foreign policy establishment who accept that this has been a crisis created by the West, by NATO, and by the attempts to encircle the Russians. I mean, I guess everyone has seen the map, haven't they, of the new members of NATO since 1991, starting at the Baltics, the 3 Baltic republics, and down through Poland, the Czech Republic, Albania, all of those countries which have become part of NATO, with the exception in Europe only of Switzerland and Austria, and this is about encircling the Russians. Now, I see that there are some anti-Russian commentators on the left, like George Monbiot, who's saying, "Oh, it's because they were frightened. They were frightened of the Russians. That's why they joined NATO." Well, it's not only the countries that have joined NATO who have a motivating force in this question. There are also other countries who are motivated and interested. And of course, the most obvious one is the US, the global hegemon. I mean, this is a US-led strategy to try and isolate Russia. And of course, as someone like John Mearsheimer, not a leftist, says, that the Russians could never accept that. They could never accept that kind of positioning of missiles on their front lawn, just like the Americans wouldn't accept the missiles in Cuba back in 19.
Well, it's worth pointing out that actually 300 miles from Ukraine to Moscow is a bit closer than Cuba is to Washington. Martin Summers, can you just give us your take on the rights and wrongs of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? They don't like calling it an invasion, but I think if you've got tanks and boots on the ground, and that's the best word to use to describe it. And particularly your thoughts on the cancelling of RT this week. It's a channel that both you and I have been on. Actually, I was on since about 2010, and you have been on even just this week on an RT which you can no longer pick up in Britain.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been on RT since about 2014, which is, of course, a fairly regular contributor, which is, of course, when the coup took place in Kiev, which brought to power a non-democratically elected government, which then led the Russians to, push for a referendum in Crimea where the people didn't want to be part of the Ukraine, and in fact, historically never were part of the Ukraine. They were only put in the Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev, when it didn't really matter because they were all part of the Soviet Union anyway. And if you look at what I said on RT on Tuesday, there has been a court case in Kiev where the Berkut riot police were put on trial, supposedly for shooting dead up to 80 demonstrators. But in actual fact, what happened was that their legal team were able to prove that they didn't shoot the demonstrators because the people who did shoot the demonstrators confessed on a video link from Georgia that they had done it and that they had been orchestrated by Saakashvili, who used to be the president of Georgia, and that there were Georgians and Lithuanians who actually did the killing, and that it was all orchestrated by a US Marine colonel who they identified. Now, this should have been major news in the West because it completely undermines the narrative about an uprising to join the EU. The pro-EU demonstrators and several police officers were all shot through the head by professional snipers orchestrated by Western intelligence services.
Martin, if I can just interrupt a second, because I did a poll this week. I got particularly annoyed when at the end of last week, over last weekend, I kept hearing the sovereign nation of Ukraine. The sovereign nation of Ukraine has been invaded. There seemed to be an extra stressing of this word sovereign. So I did a little Twitter poll, and over 100 people responded. I mean, that's just, I'm afraid I've not got millions of Twitter followers like, some celebrity or whatever. But the overwhelming majority, 90%, would say actually, no, it's not a sovereign country. It's a puppet country of the West. So there is a tremendous amount of propaganda. I just want to get your thoughts on the significance and the ramifications of the shutting down of your voice and the channel you were on across the UK by the corporations, not by Ofcom, but by people like YouTube and the people that run the what do you call it? Freeview channels, Sky. These individual private corporations have shut it down, not Ofcom.
Well, what I said on RT on Tuesday was you can ban anything you like, but it's an admission of failure. Why is it that we can listen to Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya, which is the voice of Saudi Arabia, and there's all sorts of stuff up there, which isn't Fox News, which is just rabidly pro-war. They don't get censored, but Russia Today does. I think it's an admission of it's actually a backhanded compliment, because Russia Today was actually presenting a balanced view. It was obviously pro-Russian, but it was essentially far more intellectual than a lot of the stuff that's put out by the West, analytical. And the fact that they don't want to listen to that, for example, the point I was making when you spoke about the massacre in the Maidan Square, that is just not available in any Western media, even though a court case in Kiev had found that the Berkut riot police were not guilty because it had been carried out by a Western-backed death squad. Now, this is the sort of thing that ought to be devastating for the narrative of Western public opinion in relation to this conflict. Now, let's come to the issue of whether Ukraine is an independent state. Serbia was an independent state, and part of that independent state, and I was an aid worker in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, part of that independent state was Kosovo, which had been part of Serbia since the end of the Second World War, and in fact part of Yugoslavia going back to 1918. It had never had an independent republic in the setup inside communist Yugoslavia, because the communist regime didn't really trust the local people because they'd sided with the Germans. So that there was actually a Kosovan SS division which fought against the Yugoslav communist partisans. Anyway, in the 1970s, as part of the balancing act that Yugoslavia was, Tito had given Kosovo autonomy within Serbia. So they weren't an independent republic. They had an autonomous status, a bit like Wales within the UK today. And on the back of that, these are decisions made in the 40s. The same is true of the Ukraine. Don't forget that it was in the 1920s that most of the Russian parts of Ukraine were added to what we now call Ukraine. So this whole idea that it's been a state that's existed forever, it was only created in 1991. Yugoslavia has existed since 1918. Now, NATO went to war to free Kosovo, and it was a 78-day bombing campaign that involved bombing the TV stations, railway stations, bridges. Thousands of people were killed, but praise be, Kosovo was liberated. And you could actually say that what's happening now in Russia, it's been a very shocking thing to see, but they're basically saying we are going to create a Russian-speaking Novorussia, because that's what people voted for when you had the coup in 2014. Now, we can see that there's much wider implications of this, because it's not just about Ukraine. It's about possibly, sanctions on Russia are going to lead to an economic crisis, which is going to affect everybody.
Martin, you have sort of dodged the question, really, when it comes to RT. You say, well, they've lost.
No, they haven't lost.
They've lost. But look, Martin, let me finish the sentence. And but actually, a lot of this is a propaganda war, isn't it? And that propaganda war, the West has won. They've almost entrapped, you might say, by provoking Russia to come into Ukraine, and used it as an excuse to cut down the Russian voice around the world. Those lights going out now. And actually, the West is now dominating the way people think around the world far more than it was a week ago.
Well, they're going to do that, but it doesn't really change anything. People will find a way to access RT if they want to. And as I said on RT on Tuesday, They tried to ban the Sex Pistols and the Rolling Stones. It didn't work. And it's not going to work. Basically, anybody who wants to hear the alternative view, many of whom have never heard the word RT before, they know where to go now, don't they?
David, I wonder, as someone that's worked on propaganda for such a long time, what you make of the rights and wrongs. I know you've already touched on it, but have the West shot themselves in the foot by banning RT like this?
Well, I think this is a much wider question than just RT. The banning of Russia from SWIFT payments, the means of making bank transfers, and the beginning of sanctions such that products made by Apple and many other Western corporations are now not available to Russian citizens. This is an interesting thing, isn't it? It's something which they are trying to do to punish Putin, but which may end up spurring the development of alternative institutions, alternative internet, alternative financial transactions. The whole question about the dominance of the dollar in the world financial system is something which is actually animating some part of this conflict. So, it may rebound on them. I see that RT have moved from YouTube, where they've been banned, to Odyssey, which is an apparently freely available alternative to YouTube, although of course it is, as people will know, owned by Google. So it may well be themselves shooting themselves in the foot, but it's too soon for us to be able to tell that. I mean, I think that people can go and, of course, go and find RT on the internet, but there is a real attempt to manage down alternative voices in the public sphere, not just in relation to Russia, but in relation to all the social media firms, especially Facebook and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, whereby radical voices are managed down so that the algorithms don't spread the stuff that they put out there. And people have written about this quite recently. I saw a piece by Jonathan Cook recently, who of course now lives in Bristol, making that point. That his audience has become smaller and smaller, not because he's become less popular, but because of the algorithms of the social media companies are making it more and more difficult for alternative ideas to get out there. And of course, this RT ban is part of that process, trying to delegitimize not just alternative perspectives, but the mere fact of being Russian is what's being delegitimized here. It's an attempt to delegitimize and to make it more palatable to people that we go and kill large numbers of Russians, and that's the bottom line of it, isn't it? That's why they do this kind of delegitimization. That's why they delegitimize Muslims and Islam in this country, so that we can do bad things to them. And we shouldn't entertain any doubts or illusions about that. So yes, it might be them shooting themselves in the foot, but it is also potentially very damaging.
Well, one of the things which has not been really heard at all in the Western press is the presence of 13 Pentagon biowarfare labs in Ukraine. Now, the Russians have been complaining about this for a long time. It was initially pointed out by the Bulgarian journalist Ilyana Gatasheva that these biowarfare labs were sitting there in Ukraine, and I spoke to her earlier this week about it. 13 Pentagon biowarfare labs actually sitting over there in Ukraine. I wonder if we can hear from Diliana and then get David Miller and Martin Summers' comments about the presence of the biological warfare labs funded by the Pentagon, 13 of them sitting in Ukraine, which was obviously concerning the Russians, and nothing at all was done about it.
First, I learned about one Pentagon-funded biolaboratory in Georgia, which is called the Lugar Center. One local journalist from Georgia told me that they had such a laboratory. In the beginning, I didn't believe it. It sounded like science fiction, but I checked this information, did thorough research, and discovered more and more pieces of evidence, and obtained the documents from the U.S. Federal Contracts Registry. And it turned out that the Pentagon has spent $2.5 billion on a biological research program in 25 countries around the world, and the Pentagon has funded such biolaboratories in 25 countries around the world. Mainly, these biolaboratories are located in countries bordering on the US main rivals, Russia, China, and Iran. In particular, the Pentagon has funded biolaboratories in the following countries from the former Soviet Union that border on Russia. These are Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. In Ukraine, in particular, the Pentagon has funded 11 biolaboratories. In addition to these 11 laboratories that the Pentagon has funded, according to information that I obtained from the U.S. Federal Contract Registry, the Pentagon has awarded a private American company to rebuild and equip 2 new biolaboratories in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and in Odessa, another big city in Ukraine. And the end date indicated in the documents is 2023, the next year actually. The project started in 2021 and will be completed in 2023. So it is not just 11, it is plus 2, it is 13 laboratories actually. And all this information is based on documents, and they were published by the US government, but I discovered recently, to be precise, a week ago, I discovered that these documents were removed or were not accessible on the US government website.
It's interesting, the Pentagon funding something like this. It doesn't sound like a civilian program. What is their excuse? What do they say is going on in these biolabs?
Yes, it is a military program. It is not a civil program. It is entirely under the control of military scientists. They say that they help and assist the health of the local population. But here comes the question, why would the US government spend $2.5 billion on the health of foreign citizens instead of on the health of its own citizens? It doesn't make sense. If we don't focus on the logic now, but just read what is written in the documents, for instance, in Ukraine and in Georgia, according to information obtained from insiders, the US government has conducted biological experiments on Allied soldiers in Georgia and Ukraine. I'm talking about 1,000 soldiers in Georgia and 4,400 soldiers in Ukraine. The project that I'm talking about now, it was funded by one agency which is part of the Pentagon. It is called the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and that agency funded these 2 projects in Ukraine and Georgia involving local soldiers. In the documents, it is written that all volunteer deaths will be promptly reported, and according to the project's description, the project included blood draws being taken from these soldiers for biological research. So there isn't a lot of information about the procedures or the risks involved, but the fact that it is written all volunteer deaths will be promptly reported means that these are risky practices that could potentially have a lethal outcome.
Well, that's right. I wonder whether you think that these are in the process of being shut down. I would have thought they might be a priority for the Russians to want to go and have a look at these labs. After all, you were saying, is it, I think, 11 or 13 laboratories?
For sure, these military biolaboratories have been a concern to Russia for a long time, and many times Russian diplomats and even President Putin have raised this issue many times because these are military facilities performing biological research on the Russian border. And also there was another scandal when documents appeared, and they appeared again from the US Federal Contracts Registry, and they actually exposed the American program in one military laboratory in the United States, in which the Pentagon was seeking to buy Russian synovial tissue or biological material, and in the document it was written in the description that was released to prospective awardees that the Pentagon wants only Russian tissue, not Ukrainian or Caucasian in general, only and specifically Russian tissue. So this caused again a scandal because President Putin then said and asked, why is this program? What are they doing? Why are they collecting Russian biological material, only Russian, not Ukrainian, not Caucasian in general? And it wasn't a surprise to me that, for instance, during his press conference today, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov again stressed that the United States has funded military biolaboratories in Ukraine, and they are deemed a threat to Russia because they are on the Russian border, and potentially they can develop biological weapons. Potentially, this is what Sergei Lavrov said, and they had said this many times before.
So that's Bulgarian journalist Ileana Gatasheva, who has she was sacked from her job on a Bulgarian newspaper after she uncovered the West's smuggling arms to ISIS using the United States as its so-called destination at what they call a end-use certificate. Apparently all these weapons were going to America, but no, they were diverted and went into the hands of ISIS. So great job from Diliana. Again, a bit of a cancelled journalist, but she's carrying on, she's soldiering on and carrying on with these investigations. And I wonder, David, what you think the significance of something like this is, because she's proven there through the US's own documents from the government contract registry that they've got all these sites. Not only that, these biological warfare sites. I mean, this is a Pentagon program. It's not a civil program. And even wanting to get Russian material, that is to say, bits of Russian cultures that they can grow, synovial tissue apparently, so that they can test out various things on bits of Russian tissue to see how effective they are. Now, I mean, this is bound to be a concern to Russia, but it doesn't seem to be a concern at all to the Western press.
No, it isn't. It's a truly extraordinary story. I hadn't myself heard anything about it. Just amazing. There, of course, is lots going on, has been lots going on in the Ukraine, which Martin's alluded to some of it, including I noticed that some of the US intelligence linked funding agencies have pulled their pages on the funding that they've sent to NGOs and civil society groups in the Ukraine. I noticed also, of course, that there is a key propaganda operation which has been running in Ukraine for some time called Stop Fake, which is supposed to target fake news, but of course is, as with all these initiatives, are actually just propaganda operations for the West, funded by, quite often, mostly by Western states, or indeed by philanthropists who are state-spirited. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's been going on that we haven't properly heard about, and that we probably won't hear about, especially not now. But now is the time when this kind of material is, of course, essential. This information is essential for people to have a good sense of in order to make up their minds. I see that the analysis of the Panama Papers on Zelensky is still up on the web. I wonder if that will be the next thing to be taken down, which shows his involvement with offshore companies and how he gifted his share of the offshore companies to his key political advisor just before he became the president of Ukraine, but with he retained, or rather his wife retained, a method for continuing kickbacks such that money would continue to be paid to a company registered offshore in her name. So that there's quite a lot of material out there which the Western media could be jumping upon if they wanted to give a different perspective, or a range of balanced perspectives on the whole question of Ukraine. But they will not go anywhere near this kind of thing at present. And instead, what we see is a deluge of propaganda, including on social media. I don't know if you want to talk about that as well, but the social media war is quite interesting, especially the use of apparently grassroots video footage on Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and the like. But yeah, I mean, a veritable deluge of propaganda.
Have you got any examples then of propaganda that's been sent out through social media?
Well, I mean, the traditional propaganda, of course, one can point to Snake Island, can't one? The Ukrainian soldiers who were given posthumous medals and then turned up alive in Moscow. But in terms of social media, if you look at TikTok or Instagram, you see quite a lot of stuff showing that Russian soldiers crying, or their mothers exclaiming. Or there's one particular thing I've seen 3 versions of, which is I don't know if anyone else has seen this, but it's allegedly a Ukrainian driver who pulls up beside a Russian tank which is allegedly run out of petrol, thus indicating the Russians aren't very good at these kind of things. And the Ukrainian offers to give the Russian a toll back to Russia, and makes a joke about it, and they exchange some words. Now, I've seen different versions of that footage, the same footage, but with 3 different translations of the dialogue, and it appears that the dialogue is being updated to take cognizance of the most recent elements of the propaganda war. So the third one that I saw, the latest one I saw, has a reference to massive Russian casualties, which of course was not part of the propaganda narrative in the days prior to that, but had just become so. So we're obviously seeing, perhaps let's imagine the first one of these clips was genuine. I don't believe that would be the case, but let's imagine that was the case. Certainly the second and third one, where the dialogue has been tweaked, are not genuine. They're propaganda. And of course, we saw the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, declaring that Britain would be strongly involved in strategic communications in the Ukraine crisis. Now, that's a pretty clear acknowledgement that British military and other propaganda operations will be in full flow, which of course means deception and misinformation. What he's referring to, most probably, certainly will be part of the effort, is the British Army's 77th Brigade, lionised in the press as the Twitter troops of the British military, and their expertise is in fake social media accounts in Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and I've no doubt now in TikTok. So I've no doubt that some of the stuff that we're seeing will be 77th Brigade sourced and put out there to make it look like it's grassroots video footage from Kiev or whatever else. And people will have seen, I guess, there's a number of allegations floating around on both sides, isn't there, about footage which has been faked or used, footage which has been taken from Gaza to illustrate what the Russians are supposed to have done, and various other allegations like that. So, and we'll see a lot more of that, I guess. So the extent to which there's a lot of propaganda being slung at this thing, and the hope that some of it will stick is extraordinary. Martin mentioned Fox News, and I thought it would be useful just to pause on that for a second, because there's a thing on Fox News the other day, wasn't there? A Pentagon advisor, a guy called McGregor, who gave a starkly different analysis of what's happening in the Ukraine to the one that you get in the mainstream media. And it's extraordinary, really, isn't it, that even somewhere like Fox News, where the newscaster, their head almost exploded when this Pentagon analyst came on, because they couldn't understand that this was a completely different analysis, saying that the Russians are now taking over most of the Ukraine, the game is largely over, and that what will happen is that the Russians will want to have part of Ukraine in their sphere of influence. They'll not be going anywhere else. They'll not be invading or trying to take Western Ukraine or indeed for anywhere else at all. And the newscaster couldn't get to grips with that. So we're seeing people like Pentagon advisors, Henry Kissinger, even people like Nigel Farage, making more rational analyses of this issue than can almost anyone on the left in this country. And I think that's really interesting that you see that the left, the anti-war left, seems to have largely collapsed. Notwithstanding the continued existence of Stop the War, who are in their own way doing their own thing. So I think that we see a lot of propaganda here. There will be much more propaganda, and people need to be alert to it. It's absolutely clear that the British Army and indeed other Western states have their own troll farms and troll armies and bots out there trying to fabricate stuff, which will inevitably affect people's understandings of what's happening.
Yeah, and perceptions being bent as a result. Look, we were in part 2. We'll be hearing from former psychological warfare officer and he used to work for Strategic Communications Labs, Sven Hughes, giving his take on what he sees as a strategic communications operation. He's also, as you'll hear, will be pointing out that they have many army reservists now sitting in newsrooms and in the production process of our news. Yep. And so this is quite an important aspect, which, of course, the television is not telling us that the military are actually managing much of the news today. He says, well, they're reservists, but of course they're still part of the army, and that's what they're doing. So we'll be hearing from him in part 2, but a bit more from Dilyana Gutasheva now. Shorter clip this time. She is comparing, because she's old enough to remember Soviet censorship back in the 1980s, and she's comparing what she's seeing coming from the European Union now directly to Soviet censorship.
Because Bulgaria until 1989 was under we were a communist state, and we were under the ruling of the communist regime. So what the Communist Party and the communist regime did was to ban the American media at that moment. It was Radio Free Europe, and it was banned. And people, I don't remember that time because I wasn't born then, but my parents and relatives told me how people secretly smuggled radio stations and listened secretly the radio of the free world. So now we have the opposite. Here in Bulgaria, as part of the totalitarian European Union, also all Russian TV channels, IPs, everything is banned and blocked. It is not accessible. So now people switch to other methods to be able to read or to listen to alternative, the other side of the story, alternative point of view. And you can just access the site of RT. They have their own player, not only YouTube player, and you can watch RT. Why is that? I mean, if people want to be informed and to hear the other part of the story, they can. Why is this to block the TV channels and to make it harder for the people to remove media from social media? This is totalitarianism. This is what it is. This is dictatorship. I have no words how to put it, because what they did during the communist regime in Bulgaria, now the European bureaucrats are doing the same now. This is not journalism. This is totalitarian regime, literally. For instance, in Slovakia yesterday, their prosecutor general said that if anybody publish a comment on social media in support of Russia, because for Slovakia it is that Russia is performing genocide. So who supports Russia on social media by commenting in favor of Russia will go to jail, because he or she commits a crime and will go to jail and could be imprisoned by up to 3 years in prison. Can you imagine? Is this normal? Could this happen in your country?
Well, perhaps it could. And that's Dilyana Katasheva there, a Bulgarian journalist, talking about the Soviet-style censorship that's now going on. But shockingly, David, we've got the Czech government now saying if you support Russia on some Twitter comment that you could go to jail for up to 3 years. Now, what the hell is going on?
Well, it's a very, very serious attempt to squash all dissent in the area. I mean, the attacks on Stop the War Coalition in this country are extremely serious. And Stop the War has kind of retreated slightly under the weight of them, which is disappointing. And I notice, of course, that the 11 members of the alleged socialist campaign group within the Labour Party who had signed the Stop the War letter took their names off it under pressure from the Starmer leadership. That's pretty extraordinary. That's the kind of thing which Blair didn't get to in his period.
Could you just explain that what was going on with the letter and why they withdrew their names?
Well, there was a letter, open letter by Stop the War, condemning the invasion, as they called it, of Ukraine by the Russians, but also making the point that NATO is not innocent in such matters, and the Starmer leadership told them that they had to withdraw their names. These 11 MPs who are members of the Socialist Campaign Group, the group led, remember, by John McDonnell and formerly Jeremy Corbyn when he was allowed to be in the Labour Party. And so they all withdrew their names. I mean, extraordinary. I mean, they if they had kept their names in, presumably what the next move would have been to suspend them from the party and put them in the same position as Corbyn. And they showed that they knew where the power was and they weren't even going to make the fight. And that it really shows the collapse of the left in the Labour Party, and indeed wider than that. I think the Stop the War position is of course eminently defensible, but they have themselves found themselves really under heavy attack by the establishment, not just the establishment in the Labour Party, but the establishment more widely. And we're faced with a position where the people who can speak out, or the only people who are willing to speak out, it seems, are people on the right who are occasionally making rational sense, which people might find surprising, but it's just true. I mean, it's the same as the person who you've got coming up soon is Scott Ritter. I mean, Scott comes from a Republican background. He's a right-wing commentator, but he has been consistently sensible on these matters for some considerable time. And just like we've had with someone like Mearsheimer, the academic John Mearsheimer, who's made whose view on this, we've listened to his podcast on this, is that this crisis is one of the West's making. It's not the Russians making; it's the West making. Listen to his analysis. Henry Kissinger is on our side of the argument. Can you imagine?
Well, yes, I can imagine. And you know what? Kissinger is always one step ahead, David, isn't he? He seems to be somehow managed that. Martin Summers, can you briefly give us your take on what's happened to the left, and particularly with the disciplinarian Starmer in the Labour Party saying, well, if you say that NATO may have had a role in provoking this, then you're out of the party?
Yeah, well, this campaign group has just been said have withdrawn their signing of the Stop the War statement. I believe Claudia Webb and Jeremy Corbyn have still got their names appended to it because they're not in the Labour Party and they can't be thrown out of the Labour Party because they ain't in it. Tomorrow in Bristol at midday, there is a Stop the War demonstration assembling, I believe, on College Green. I'm not sure. The Stop the War position is that they're against the invasion of Ukraine, they're against NATO, and they're against sanctions on Russia. It'll be interesting to see who turns up, because I suspect some pro-Ukrainian people may turn up to that demonstration. But, you can see why the Stop the War movement might say, well, we've got to oppose the invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, we've got to bring all these other things up as well. And they're pointing out the people in Russia who are opposing the war and getting arrested and so on. But the latest opinion polls in Russia show that about 20 to 22% of the population don't support what the government's doing, but that the rest of the population do. And in the last week, Putin's opinion poll rating has gone up from 61% to 71%. And I think also people talk about this as Putin's war. It was initially forced forward by the Communist Party's resolution in the Duma about 10 days ago, saying we're going to have to recognise these two breakaway republics. Up to now, the Russian position is we're not going to recognise breakaway republics. They've got to negotiate with the government in Kiev. And that's what the Minsk agreement in 2015 was all about. Half of the legitimate land of those two republics has been occupied by the Ukrainians. And of course, those Ukrainians have been shelling the Russian population on the other side of the line. At least three prominent political figures, Givi, Motorola and Zakharchenko, have been murdered on the other side of the line by car bombs. And of course, I suspect that British special forces were very much involved in that. And I think British special forces have been very much involved in this whole run up to this war, where the Ukrainians have been massing troops in order to try and finish off what's left of these republics. And at this point, the Russians are saying you can't do this.
There are also stories of lots of mercenaries employed by the NATO countries now pouring into Ukraine in order to make, I suppose, to back up the Ukrainian forces there. Anyway, I want to get a perspective before we say goodbye to you, David, on what it's like for these Eastern European countries that are now part of NATO, just what their role is in NATO. And I asked in our final clip from Diliana about there's been a spat this week between the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister because the Defence Minister refused to send Bulgarian old MiG fighters to Poland, apparently to help with the potential engagement of Russians or Belarusian Air Force. In other words, maybe some potential kind of no-fly zone. Quite obviously, the NATO leaders in Brussels decided they'd much rather lose Bulgarian fighters and pilots rather than American F-15 or whatever pilots, and it's better to lose these Bulgarians. So it seems that the partners of NATO are very much junior partners over in Bulgaria when the defence minister is sacked because he refuses to send his. But there's more to it than that, because there's also an ongoing order of upgraded fighters from the United States to Bulgaria, which, although the Bulgarians have paid for the fighters, there's still no fighters have arrived. So Diliana takes us through that angle here now.
Bulgaria is the poorest country in the European Union, probably in NATO as well, and to enforce this country, which has 5 old fighter jets. And by the way, Bulgaria purchased new F-16s from the United States, but only on papers. Bulgaria paid for these fighter jets, but they didn't come. And nobody knows when these fighter jets will come. Their production has not been started yet. So you can imagine how many years we will wait for fighter jets that we already paid in advance. Bulgaria even took a bank loan, to be able to buy fighter jets from the United States, and they did not come. And it turned out that under the agreement that Bulgaria signed with the United States, there is no provision that could punish the United States in such case, like the case that that I am talking about now, namely, no fighter jets. And in that situation, when the United States even failed to complete its obligations to provide us with fighter jets that we already paid, and now they want from the poorest country to provide its 5 old fighter jets. These are old fighter jets from the Soviet Union, very old fighter jets, so to provide them to Ukraine so that we will have 0 fighter jets. This is what they wanted from us, and because our defense minister opposed such a decision, he was fired.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, maybe if you send your old Soviet fighter jets to Poland, maybe the Americans will send you some new fighter jets. But you'll have to get...
Absolutely no, believe me. They said that they have not started to... the manufacturers explained that because of the COVID pandemic, the production has not started yet.
Right. So they don't even exist.
No,
oh, well.
They exist only on papers in the agreement, so that there is an agreement so that Bulgaria can take a bank loan and pay to the United States for fighter jets that don't exist and probably will never exist. They exist only in the agreement.
They exist only in the agreement, but they're not turning up. Anyway, I just quite like that story because it illustrates just what a client state Bulgaria under NATO has become, David.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's what this is. This is about client state status. I mean, that's what NATO is for. It's an alliance which will, allow the Americans to project their power more effectively. And of course, Britain likes to imagine it's playing a significant role, as perhaps it actually is in terms of its special forces, as Martin was suggesting. So, I mean, I don't think we understand this enough in this country. I mean, I remember when there was a referendum on NATO membership in Spain back in the day, many decades ago now, and I remember going to Spain at the time and realising that nobody in this country, in the UK, really had any idea what NATO was. We don't have any proper debate on it. And yes, part of the left has been historically opposed to NATO, but there's no real understanding of what NATO is and what it does. And it came out of the shadows a little bit over the whole Balkan affair all those years ago. But it's a military alliance which is run by and in the interests of American imperialism. Let's be clear about that. And of course, it's the purpose of having these client states of the Lithuanians and the Estonians and the Latvians and the Poles and the Czechs. And all the rest of them is so that they can isolate Russia. I mean, if you look at Vladimir Putin has a TikTok account. Have a look at that. It's quite interesting. But there's a moment on there in one of his TikToks where he says, I spoke to Bill Clinton about this. I said, can we join NATO? And he says, well, I won't divulge the full confidence of what Bill Clinton said to me, but he was very cold on the idea. So, this is not about saying, well, any country can join NATO. It's just an alliance for people to get together Absolutely not. The Russians will not be allowed to join NATO. And what we face is the possibility of the development in the next few years to a decade of a much greater multipolarity in the world. And that's the danger that the West faces in this, of attacking Russia in such a way that multipolarity is hastened. The Russians do their own thing. They collaborate more with the Chinese. And that will have the effect of hastening the end of the unipolarity of US dominance in the world. And I think for everyone around the world who has faced American boots on their soil, that can only be a good thing. So I wonder whether the moment is not coming where power passes from the American hegemon in a way in which it did in the past in relation to France and the UK, for example. Let's remember that the UK thought it was still a significant political actor on the world stage in 1956 when it collaborated secretly with the Israelis and the French to invade Suez. The glorious moment came very shortly thereafter, where the Americans said to the British, no, and Britain had to get out. And that was the moment where the British elites realised they weren't in charge of anything anymore. They had to do what the Americans said. And maybe that moment will come sooner than many of the American foreign policy establishment think for the Americans, where they can't just do whatever they want anymore.
Well, I think it's bound to come. And in fact, maybe what's happened, particularly with the propaganda war, is that it's made that inevitable. Because without an exchange of ideas between East and West, then, or between, East and West in Europe even, it seems to me that we've set ourselves on a course for inevitable conflict of some sort. But look, propaganda's your thing, David. Some people have compared the propaganda machine that is now there in the West to Joseph Goebbels and the Second World War, the Nazi propaganda machine. Obviously now we've got this 24-hour rolling news TV, which Goebbels never had in those days. They had radio and they had the newspapers, etc., but they didn't have what we've got today in terms of TV propaganda. I may be a cynical chap, but I look at someone like Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian prime minister. I know he was actually schooled as an actor, did many, many years acting. And surely what we're seeing here is much more Hollywood than it is a genuine confrontation.
I think that there's some truth in that. Certainly there is a huge investment in propaganda in the conflict. But let's think back to, you mentioned Goebbels, right? We mentioned, the Goebbels is a touchstone for discussion of propaganda, of bad propaganda. The Germans did bad propaganda, and you compare bad people to Goebbels, whenever you want to. Like you have a new Hitler, you have Saddam Hussein's propaganda chief, etc., etc. But let's remember that Goebbels learnt his techniques from the West. He had on his bookshelves the books of Edward Bernays and Ivy Lee. He employed American PR professionals to help the German state in its war against everyone else, and indeed against the Jews and the communists, etc. So, when people talk about Goebbels and meaning bad propaganda, these are techniques which Goebbels learnt from the earliest corporate and state propagandists. Remember, of course, Bernays and Lee were corporate propagandists, but they also had worked for the American military in the First World War. So, it's something which is ever present in these kinds of conflicts, and people would really do very well in any conflict like this to check their sources, to check where information comes from, to try and read around and read different sources. And if sources contradict them, they both can't be true. And it's as well for people to understand that than to go along with the nonsense which we get wall to wall in the mainstream media over the Ukraine conflict.
I wonder, could you recommend any of because you've written quite a few books on this, if people are interested in following up this kind of analysis, David?
Well, the stuff on Edward Bernays and on Ivy Lee and the history of the corporate propaganda campaigns, indeed the history of corporate propaganda in the UK, going back to the early 20th century, is in a century of spin. So the stuff on Goebbels is in there as well. That's probably the best overall account of the development of propaganda as an instrument of power in the UK and in the West more generally.
Yeah, and I noticed there is these organisations that present TV now. In fact, there was a glitch on Wednesday. I was watching, or maybe it was Thursday morning, a glitch on the BBC where they had some splash screen come up with there was a corporate business that presents the BBC with nice, easy experts. And for some reason, the link didn't work or they had to cut the thing. But it showed. And much of the people that are presented to us as experts, David, are actually paid by an interested lobby, aren't they? So finally, I know I keep saying finally, but you did a thing called Spinwatch, which I think was very, very valuable. And so what have you found out over the years about just who these experts are? Because certainly there's no interrogation. We keep hearing people from Chatham House, Royal Institute for International Affairs, from the Royal United Services Institute. All of these so-called independent experts have got skin in the game.
Oh, they have, yes, of course. I mean, all these think tanks are part and parcel, essentially, of the military-industrial complex. I mean, the RUSI has its headquarters is in a building adjoined to the Ministry of Defence, as I'm sure most people know. And Chatham House, of course, is funded by a whole range of states, but also by large corporations, as is RUSI. Then you get the kind of foreign policy and civil liberties type area, counter-terrorism think tanks, the neocon think tanks, the Policy Exchange, the Henry Jackson Society. They're all funded, of course, by a range of states, but also intensively by the Zionist movement. And by Zionist philanthropists. So you have a lot of intransparency in that field, and you don't have people declaring their conflicts of interest in the way which they're supposed to in proper academic work, it's never the case. No one insists that the Institute of Economic Affairs tells us how much money they get from the tobacco industry or from Shell. No one says to Policy Exchange, come on. Where's this money coming from? Why are you getting hundreds of thousands of pounds every year from Zionist activists? What's that for? And of course, what it's for is to pursue particular interests, the interest of the tobacco industry, or the oil industry, or indeed of the Zionist movement. And let's not forget, of course, since we're talking about war, of the arms industry. The arms industry is very keen to have proper experiments in the use of its techniques, so they can advertise them as battle tested, and so that's what will be going on here. Maybe the same will be the case of the bio-war activities that the US appears to be engaged in. But yes, of course, this is a means for managing, manipulating, and pressuring public opinion, and indeed trying to defeat enemies.
Yeah, this particular splash screen was for something called Globalynx. That's GLOBELYNX, a global platform elevating brands by connecting experts to broadcasters. They offer, they say, a range of add-on services, including software to record and edit videos, live streaming, media training, editorial advice and promotion. And this, of course, is massively well funded, and our broadcasters simply cut and paste the opinions of these individuals straight onto our TV screens. Anyway, Dr. David Miller, thank you ever so much for joining us, and very enlightening it was. And I'll put a link up to David's books on our show page at thisweek.org.uk.